Welcome to the second part of our Heritage Talk, an introduction to environmental archaeology. In this part, we discover the team at Wessex Archaeology.
So what do we do when we study plant remains and particularly macrobotanical remains in archaeological sites? Well, one of the main purposes is to study past diet. So for example, if we have luck and we find bug body with plant remains in the stomach, we can be quite certain that those plant remains were part of the diet. But that's a very rare scenario, and often we have to study diet through other indirect indicators like plant remains preserved in teeth. For example, the calculus in teeth can preserve phytoliths and pollen grains and lipids from plants. Or we can study residues in pottery that were used for cooking. We can also study bread that was used in the past, and sometimes we can identify plant remains still, for example, in bread that wasn't very well ground. And we can also study, this is 90% of the cases, plant remains that were carbonized, and we can try to interpret which of those plant remains that were carbonized were actually part of food products and which weren't. One of the main problems in archaeological sites is to find out whether the plant remains that we find are part of intentional products that were brought to the site, or if they were accidentally present there. So for example, seeds like these with spikes, they are usually found in archaeological sites, and they may have arrived attached to clothing or to animal hair. Plants like these produce seeds that are dispersed by wind and can also arrive very easily to archaeological sites unintentionally and end up being charred in a fire. And there are other ways in which plants can arrive in a similar accidental manner. Another way, for example, is the case of weeds, or what we call weeds, which are wild plants growing in crop fields, and these were probably gathered accidentally in most of the cases, although some of those plants might be useful. But anyway, they were brought unintentionally to the site, and then they were discarded, and they are often carbonized. Fortunately, these types of plants are usually informative about the growing conditions of crop fields, so they are not completely useless. And the other main point of environmental archaeology, as the name suggests, is studying the environment. The problem with studying past environments is that all archaeological evidence is biased in some way by how it is preserved and where it is preserved. So to study past environments, we normally need to put together a lot of data originating from different types of evidence. So for example, we need to put together pollen data and waterlogged plant remains from same deposit to obtain a picture of how the environment was. So now, who are we? We environmental archaeologists at Wessex. Well, we have a team of 7 people. We have Jenny and Liz, who work in the processing team in Salisbury, and Fiona in Sheffield, and they are in charge of preparing the samples that arrive from archaeological sites. They are doing something called flotation, which is separation of floating light fraction of the samples from the sediment. And this floating fraction, which is called the float, is usually rich in environmental evidence such as seeds and charcoal and snails and insects. So the float that is retained here, it's later dried and studied, sorted under the microscope by Nikki, who's here separating the different types of environmental material from samples. then I am given the extracted material from each sample, and I then identify the plant remains in them, usually with the help of reference collection and also with specialized atlases. And then I produce reports informing about how the landscape was on the site or what plants were people using at the period of occupation. I'm going to speak a little bit about my background because that's going to influence a lot how which types of sites I'm going to select from my experience in Wessex Archaeology. So in the past, I've always been involved in all stages of the process in environmental archaeology, from taking the samples to processing them and studying them. So this is actually quite lucky because I have now people doing the dirty work for me. But anyway, I've been doing my PhD in the use of plants by Mesolithic and Neolithic people in the Iberian Peninsula. So Mesolithic and Neolithic, for those of you who are not familiar, are the basically periods where we have the change from hunting and gathering as a way of life to farming. And that's quite interesting because why did that happen? We still don't know why that happened. And it's very different in different parts of the world. So it has scope for a lot of research. So I've been doing that in, as I said, in the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, but I've been also doing that in Syria and in Argentina, the first settlers. And I've also researched the first settlers in the Balearic Islands, who were as well the first farmers. And because I'm very, very interested in the last hunting gathering and the early farmers, I'm also very interested in hazelnuts, which are very important resources in these types of chronologies. So I have selected a few of my favorite studies that I've undertaken at Wessex. We have, for example, the case of soil archaeology, where we have colleagues, usually in advance of building wind farms, go and take samples of core samples through the sediments and the water. These core samples are then studied by our colleagues, the geoarchaeologists, who select the most appropriate sediments for taking samples. So, for example, here. And they provide us with samples that we then process and study the plant remains of information on how the environment was when those lands were emerged rather than submerged. Similar type of environment, but very different type of archaeology is the one from Coastal and Marine Department. And for example, we have studied 2 wrecks recently with stable wrecks in Kent. We have Tankerton, which is a 16th century wreck that was found accidentally in the coast of Whitstable. And we took several samples from this wreck. We found this seed here of fruit that had me puzzled for a very, very long time. I spent hours and hours trying to identify it. This scale here is 1 millimeter. Finally, I eventually discovered that it wasn't a seed associated to the wreck at all. It was just a fossil that was present in the environment that had been washed on the site. But fortunately, we had lots of other evidence of the use of the wreck. So we have this cereal brand, which informs about diet by the people who use the wreck and the sanitary conditions, which weren't great because this is preserved in fecal material. But we also found lots of plant remains from wild plants, either plant macrofossils, so seeds, but also pollen grains. And this particular case is very interesting because this is spruce pollen grain, which is not a native tree in the UK, and it's growing mostly in the Baltic area. So this informs us about this ship having probably traveled to the Baltic while it was not wrecked. These hairs were also found in the caulking, and we haven't analyzed them ourselves, but we have sent them to an external specialist who identified goats and sheep and horse, and these are animals that the hairs of these animals were mainly used for caulking in Scandinavia. So thanks to environmental evidence, we can suggest that this sheep had very strong connection with the Scandinavian region, while before we only thought that it was a local sheep. We also found a very exciting seed. This is a kiwi seed, and because this is 16th century, this could be an indicator of very early trade. Kiwi is not a native plant of Europe. It grows in Southeast Asia, and its presence in archaeological deposit could indicate that there was trade with that part of the world. However, we radiocarbonated it and it was modern, so we had our exciting discovery of the century lost. The other wreck that we studied recently is the old brick in Sea Salter, and it's 1 century later than Tankerton. We took several samples from it, and they all represent the depositional environment of when the ship was wrecked, which is not very exciting, but we found also plant remains inside this olive jar of Spanish origin. And it is exciting because we think that this vessel was associated with smuggling, and we found plum and walnuts, which may have been smuggled products together with other things that were smuggled.
Thank you for watching part 2 of our Heritage Talk, an introduction to environmental archaeology.